This episode discusses a mass shooting and gender-based violence. Some listeners may find the content disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. December 6th, 1989. A gunman walked into Montreal's École Polytechnique engineering school. Within 20 minutes, he murdered 14 women, injured 14 more, and left behind a suicide note declaring his hatred for feminists. Welcome to Northern Dark. Tonight, we revisit the Montreal Massacre, the tragedy that scarred a nation, reshaped Canadian gun laws, and became a defining moment in the fight against gender-based violence in Canada. École Polytechnique, affiliated with Université de Montréal, was, and still is, one of Canada's most prestigious engineering schools. By 1989, it had been training engineers for over a century, producing many of Quebec's top professionals. The building itself, a concrete structure perched on the north side of Mount Royal, stood as a symbol of progress and academic ambition. But progress was uneven. Engineering was still overwhelmingly male. In 1989, only about 17% of the students at École Polytechnique were women. They were pioneers in their field, navigating classrooms, labs, and workplaces that often doubted their place there. Many of the women in those lecture halls had grown up being told engineering wasn't for girls, yet they persisted, pushing into spaces where they had rarely been welcomed before. This was not just a story of a school, it reflected a wider cultural shift. Canada in the late 1980s was in the midst of debates about women's rights. Feminism had become more visible. Campaigns for equal pay, better workplace protections, and reproductive rights made headlines. The Supreme Court's 1988 decision striking down Canada's abortion law had been celebrated by many as a victory for women's freedom. But that same progress triggered resentment. Some saw these gains as threatening the traditional order. Montreal itself was a city of contrasts in 1989, cosmopolitan, culturally vibrant, bilingual, and politically charged. It had a reputation for tolerance and intellectual life, yet it was not immune to sexism, discrimination, and social backlash. For young women studying engineering at École Polytechnique, Montreal could feel like a city of opportunity, but also a place where they were reminded daily that they were still the minority in their field. December 6th was a Wednesday. The first snows of winter had already touched the city, and the campus was alive with the routine of end-of-term exams. Students hurried through hallways with textbooks under their arms, groups studied in the cafeteria, and classrooms were full of the nervous energy that always comes with finals season. For most of the students that day, the biggest worry was their next exam, their GPA, or their plans for the holidays. The atmosphere inside École Polytechnique was ordinary in every way. A normal winter day in Montreal, a school alive with possibility, with ambition, with the laughter and nerves of young students who believed they were building their futures. No one could have known that in less than an hour, this ordinary scene would become the setting of the deadliest school shooting in Canadian history. At around 5:10 p.m., December 6, 1989, Marc Lépine walked through the front doors of École Polytechnique. He was 25 years old, wearing jeans, work boots, and a jacket that hid the weapon slung underneath. In his hands was a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle. Strapped to his body, a hunting knife. In his bag, boxes of ammunition. He had chosen his target carefully, and he moved with grim determination. He headed straight upstairs to the second floor and into a mechanical engineering classroom where about 60 students were preparing for a presentation. The professor had barely registered his presence when Lépine shouted for everyone's attention. He ordered the men to stand on one side of the room and the women to the other. At first, some thought it was a joke, a prank, maybe a drill. But when he raised his rifle, the truth was undeniable. The words he spoke have been seared into Canadian history. You are all feminists. I hate feminists. He leveled the weapon at the women clustered by the chalkboard and opened fire. The first bullets cracked through the classroom, deafening and final. 6 women were struck. 3 were killed instantly. 9 men, ordered out of the room, bolted through the doors, fleeing into the hallways. Their escape left behind chaos, screams, and the sound of reloading as the massacre began in earnest. From there, Lépine stalked through the corridors of the school. Witnesses described him moving with a chilling calmness, as if he had rehearsed the slaughter. He entered another classroom and fired at women crouched beneath desks. In the cafeteria, students enjoying dinner scattered in panic as bullets tore through the air. One survivor later recalled the surreal image of trays crashing to the floor, food spilling, and the sound of screams echoing off the tiled walls. He hunted deliberately, seeking out women. In some rooms, he ignored men entirely, sparing them while shooting the women beside them. Survivors described him pausing between bursts of gunfire to reload. The sharp click of metal on metal carrying as much terror as the rifle itself. He showed no sign of hesitation, no remorse, only focus. Some students played dead to survive. Others dragged classmates into closets and behind lab benches. In one corridor, a professor barricaded his classroom door with a desk, holding it shut as terrified students crouched in the dark, listening to footsteps and gunshots echoing just outside. By the time Lépine reached the school's 3rd floor, he had entered another classroom where a group of engineering students were completing their presentations. Once again, he singled out the women. The violence was swift, methodical, and merciless. In the span of just under 20 minutes, Marc Lépine shot 28 people. 14 women were murdered. 14 others, both women and men, were wounded. And then, in a classroom that had fallen into stunned silence, he turned the rifle on himself. The building was left in chaos. The halls were littered with backpacks, books, broken glass. Survivors described the scene as a war zone, students crying, calling for help, and a silence afterward that felt almost heavier than the gunfire itself. For those who lived through it, time seemed to stop. The sound of his footsteps, the ringing in their ears, the silence after each shot, those details never faded. One survivor later said, "The quiet after the gunfire was worse than the noise." That's when you realized who wasn't moving anymore. It was, and remains, the deadliest school shooting in Canadian history. A calculated act of violence carried out in the heart of Montreal that would change the country forever. When police entered École Polytechnique, the sound of gunfire had faded into silence. What they found instead was confusion and grief. Classrooms were in disarray, chairs overturned, papers scattered across floors, and the sense of shock hanging heavily in the air. Students who had hidden during the attack were slowly emerging. Some clung to each other in tears, others were frozen in place, too stunned to move. Paramedics rushed in behind officers, guiding survivors out of the building while tending to those who were hurt. Their calm voices and hurried footsteps echoed down the halls. Outside, the street filled with flashing lights. Ambulances and police cars lined the snowy curb, their sirens cutting through the night. Families had gathered, desperate for news. Parents and loved ones called out names, scanning each stretcher as it came through the doors. For some, there was relief. For others, only silence. The news spread quickly. Montreal was stunned. Canada was stunned. Reporters on the scene struggled to explain what had happened, their voices heavy with disbelief. By midnight, the city had turned to mourning. Churches opened their doors for vigils. Across Quebec, bells tolled in remembrance. Parliament observed a moment of silence. And from Vancouver to Halifax, Canadians lit candles in windows, churchyards, and public squares. Flowers appeared on the steps of École Polytechnique, frozen into the winter snow. Almost immediately, debate began. Some called it the isolated act of a troubled man, but for many, that explanation rang hollow. This was targeted violence, directed at women in a place of learning. Survivors and advocates insisted the truth had to be faced. This was gender-based violence, and it could not be ignored. For the families of the 14 women who were killed, grief came swiftly. Funerals followed in the days after, each one drawing classmates, professors, and communities together in sorrow. Across Canada, people bowed their heads, reflecting not only on the lives lost, but also on what the tragedy revealed about the society they lived in. The École Polytechnique Massacre left Montreal heartbroken, and Canada forever changed. On that cold December night, the country lost not only 14 young women, but also the sense of safety it doesn't take for granted anymore. The École Polytechnique Massacre was not just another headline, it was a national turning point. The shock of December 6th rippled outward, reshaping conversations about gender, violence, and safety in Canada. In the immediate years that followed, Canadians began to formalize remembrance. In 1991, Parliament declared December 6th as the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. Each year since, ceremonies have been held across the country, from Montreal to Vancouver, from Guelph to Halifax. At École Polytechnique, 14 white roses are laid out, one for each victim. Candles are lit, bells toll, and the names of the women are read aloud, ensuring they are remembered as individuals, not just as numbers. Universities across Canada hold vigils, where students gather in silence, placing roses on memorial plaques and reflecting on the lives lost. For engineering schools in particular, the massacre remains a solemn reminder of the challenges women have faced, and still face, in entering male-dominated fields. The massacre also became a rallying point for activism. Survivors, friends, and family members of the victims refused to let the tragedy fade into silence. They demanded change. Women like Heidi Rathjen, who was a student at Polytechnique that night, transformed their grief into advocacy. They spoke publicly, organized campaigns, and confronted politicians, insisting that the country address both the violence itself and the ease with which Lépine obtained his weapon. The Ruger Mini 14, the semi-automatic rifle used in the attack, became a grim symbol in the years that followed. It sparked fierce debate about gun control in Canada. In 1991, reforms tightened the rules for firearms acquisition and storage. By 1995, further legislation, Bill C-68, introduced mandatory licensing and registration. Advocates pointed directly to the events of December 6th as the catalyst. Yet even decades later, the weapon remains at the center of political arguments, with survivors of the massacre continuing to speak out whenever its regulation is questioned. Beyond legislation, the cultural impact was profound. For many Canadians, the massacre was the moment when the reality of gender-based violence could no longer be denied. Feminist scholars called it an act of gender-based terrorism, an attack designed to intimidate women from claiming space in professions and in public life. That framing shifted the national conversation. This wasn't about one disturbed individual. It was about misogyny, systemic, persistent, and deadly. Even today, the memory of December 6th continues to shape lives. Universities hold scholarships and bursaries in the victims' names, encouraging young women to pursue engineering. Memorials across the country, in libraries, campuses, and public squares, stand as reminders of the cost of hate. And every year, Canadians gather again, in silence and candlelight, to say their names, to mourn, and to recommit themselves to the fight against gender-based violence. The legacy of the École Polytechnique Massacre is therefore twofold: grief for what was lost and resolve to ensure it never happens again. The massacre is often remembered in statistics: 14 women killed, 14 more people wounded, but they were not numbers. They were daughters, sisters, classmates, friends. They were women with ambitions, families, and futures ahead of them. To honor their memory, we must speak their names. Geneviève Bergeron, 21. A scholarship student in civil engineering, talented in music. She sang in a choir and played clarinet. She was bright, creative, and full of promise. Hélène Colgan, 23. A mechanical engineering student in her final year, preparing to pursue a master's degree in aeronautics. She dreamed of building a career in aviation. Nathalie Croteau, 23. About to graduate in civil engineering, she was remembered as warm and outgoing, with a smile that lifted every room she entered. Barbara Dayneau, 22, a gifted mechanical engineering student and teaching assistant, admired by classmates for her generosity and dedication to helping others succeed. Anne-Marie Edward, 21. Studying chemical engineering, she loved sports, the outdoors, and adventure. Friends recalled her as determined and full of life. Maud Haviernick, 29, a materials engineering student who had previously worked in architecture. She returned to school to expand her career and was admired for her perseverance. Barbara Kluchnik-Budayevich, 31, a nursing student at the nearby Université de Montréal. She was visiting a friend at Polytechnique that evening, unknowingly walking into tragedy. Maryse Laguinière, 25. She worked in the school's finance department and had recently married. She was described as cheerful, reliable, and deeply kind. Maryse Leclerc, 23, a fourth-year student in materials engineering, remembered for her compassion and for the energy she brought to her classmates' lives. Anne-Marie Lemay, 22, a mechanical engineering student, devoted to volunteering and helping others. Friends remembered her as generous and selfless. Sonia Pelletier, 28, in her final year of mechanical engineering. She was preparing to graduate as class valedictorian, a recognition of her brilliance and leadership. Michelle Richard, 21, a second-year student in materials engineering, remembered for her warmth, kindness, and love for her studies. Annie Saint-Arnaud, 23, a mechanical engineering student remembered as cheerful, positive, and close with her family and friends. Annie Turcotte, 20, a metallurgical engineering student. She loved animals, family, and was deeply cherished by her loved ones. These were the 14 women whose lives ended that night, women who might have become engineers, leaders, innovators, mothers, mentors. Their absence is still felt today, in their families, in their communities, and across Canada. Every December 6th, their names are spoken again at vigils across the country. Candles are lit, roses are laid, and Canadians pause to remember not only the tragedy, but also the promise of the lives that were taken. They are not forgotten. I'm your host, Marc.
I'm Leah. Thank you for coming back to our podcast. This is episode 10 for us, and we are grateful to all of the listeners across Canada, America, Europe, and Australia. I want to thank all of you that have watched, liked, and subscribed to our YouTube channel. We have 11,000 views already. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to everyone for posting comments to our videos. Violent crime is on the rise, and many Canadians are frustrated and angry that they are not safe in their own homes. We hope our videos and podcast will help influence those in our government to bring about change to make us safer in our own homes and communities.
Today's episode examines the tragic shooting at a Montreal university on December 6, 1989, which targeted women.
That night in Montreal left scars that still haven't healed, Leah. 14 women, most of them so young, killed because they dared to study engineering and because they dared to enter a space society still thought of as belonging to men.
Yes. And what still shakes me is how deliberate it was. This wasn't random, it wasn't impulsive. Marc Lépine singled them out. He told the men to leave, and he turned his hatred directly at the women. That's why so many people describe it as gender-based terrorism. He wanted to terrify women, to push them out of certain professions and out of public life.
And in a way, it was a message, but a message that backfired. He wanted to silence them, but instead, their names are spoken every December 6th. Their memory has become a rallying cry.
Exactly. The vigils, the roses, the ceremonies, and they're not just rituals. They're acts of defiance against the hatred that motivated him. Those women's futures were stolen, but the cause of gender equality they stood for was strengthened.
And there's also the impact on gun laws. The Ruger Mini 14 he used became a symbol in the years after. Survivors and families pushed hard for reforms, and they achieved changes that might not have happened otherwise. Yet even today, debates about that same weapon still divide Canadians.
That's the heartbreaking part. Survivors like Heidi Rathjen, who lived through it, turned their trauma into activism. They fought for stricter gun control, for recognition of gender-based violence. But it shouldn't take a massacre for society to listen to women.
And it shows how deeply uncomfortable people were, and still are, with naming misogyny as the motive. For years, some tried to dismiss it as the act of a lone, disturbed man. But when you read his suicide note, when you hear what survivors remember him shouting, there's no denying it. He targeted women because they were women.
And when you frame it that way, you see the larger picture, and that gender-based violence doesn't only happen in the shadows or behind closed doors. It can erupt in the most public, devastating ways, and ignoring that makes us complicit.
That's why we tell stories like this one, to remember the women as individuals, not just as victims, and to recognize that the issues they died for are still with us. Women in engineering programs today still talk about December 6th. They carry that history with them.
And they carry it with strength, because remembering is an act of resistance. Every time those names are read, every time a candle is lit, it's a reminder that the hatred didn't win. It tried to erase them, but instead, it made sure they'd never be forgotten.
We dedicate this episode to the victims of the Montreal shooting, and we hope that we all stand up against all forms of violence in our society.
Please continue to like, share, and subscribe to our podcast on X and YouTube at Northern Dark TCC. Thank you for helping our channel grow.
We'll be back next Monday. Until then, take care of each other.